in Boots: The Last Wish is one of my favorite movies ever. I think it's completely and utterly fantastic. So naturally, I had to go and actually watch the other Shrek films, the original Puss in Boots, because I'd never seen them. Absolutely love this character, and I'd never even seen the movies he was originally from. I'd only seen the original Shrek a whole bunch as a kid, and never any of the others, not even Shrek 2. Anyway, after watching everything, I started to become curious on when exactly Puss lost his lives, now that that bit of canon has been retroactively added. And how old is he? First, I want to do a quick ranking of the movies, since everyone always has pretty strong opinions about them. So, might as well get mine out of the way. I'll put something on screen. So first, obviously, The Last Wish. I made that clear from the jump. And it's not even a contest. I'm going to put a gap even. It's just too good. But then, perhaps controversially, I have the original Puss in Boots. And to add even more to that controversy, next is Forever After. I understand why people like the first two Shreks more than these ones. And these ones are definitely less of the Shrek style that those first two movies, technically the third, establish. But I just like how these movies take their characters a bit more seriously and don't treat them as joke machines. Not to say that the first two movies are bad. I still like them, just not as much as these ones. And it's honestly hard to pick between the two which one I like more, so I'm going to rank them together here. And then, absolutely massive gulf before Shrek the Third. Oh man, if you've never seen it, and you think people are exaggerating how bad it is, no. They absolutely are not exaggerating how bad this movie is. It's not even just a bad sequel. It's just an awful movie. I haven't seen terribly many bad or disappointing movies in my life. I tend to watch things I'm pretty confident I'm going to enjoy. So, it's one of the worst things I've ever seen. It's just terrible. It's funny to me how Forever After just takes some of the ideas of Shrek the Third and then just does them again, but better this time. Anyway, that's the ranking. Not actually relevant to figuring out anything about Puss, but hey, always fun to have a little ranking. With it out of the way, I want to start by working out what Puss's age is. His first film does the heavy lifting here, but I'm going to start with the 3 Shreks he's in, because they're close to each other, have the most connections, easy to figure stuff out. On that note, there's a whole bunch of shorts and specials that he's in and whatever, but they're all really close to their respective movies or within this time span, so that doesn't mean anything for the timeline. Anyway, like I said, 3 Shreks here are pretty close together. In Shrek the Third, we learn Fiona is pregnant, and in Forever After, their children are celebrating their first birthday, meaning just under 2 years have passed since Shrek the Third to Forever After. We aren't given much, direct time from the second film going to the third, but it can't be terribly long after, as awful as the movie is, and it's terrible at handling its plot and characters. It seems ridiculous for Prince Charming to wait more than a few months, at most, to decide to enact revenge. So, for me, I think these 3 films cover about 2 years worth of time. Not long at all, in terms of figuring out a character's age, but the fact that he's spending this time in Far, Far Away is important for his deaths later. With that, also, he was clearly in Far, Far Away for long enough to set up at the Poison Apple and become a mercenary with a reputation for being an ogre killer. Absolutely bizarre that he does that after we learn his origin, but I guess that's what happens when you develop a prequel after a character has changed over time so many years on. Anyway, I imagine it would take a decent amount of time for Puss to establish himself like he did. Probably months, but I doubt it would have been years. So honestly, I don't think it has that much time here. Then there's the matter of after Forever After. Somehow, we get to the last wish, where he has returned to Spain and is well known and regarded across the whole country. Surely that had to take a while, and he definitely acts much older. He also had to reconnect with and fall out with Kitty, which surely that also had to take a significant amount of time. Plus, his last line refers to Shrek and the others as old friends, which very much implies it has been many years since he last saw them. I definitely think the time jump to the last wish is pretty significant. None of this is helpful, though, when we don't have something more concrete to go off of, and thankfully, the original Puss in Boots gives us what we need. When Puss and Humpty Dumpty first argue, Humpty explicitly says it's been 7 years since they last saw each other.
How long are you going to hold a grudge? It's been 7 years.
Then in flashback, Puss states that they were teenagers when he became a folk hero, and it's implied to not be that much later when Humpty tricks him into robbing the town bank. The moment that leads to Puss being an outlaw and being 7 years ago, as Humpty mentioned. Teenager isn't a specific age, but it isn't a wide range, and 7 years later puts Puss in his early to mid-20s during the events of the film. Personally, I lean towards him being in his mid-20s. It just seems unlikely that the flashback stuff had him being like 13 instead of 16, 17. And it also seems unlikely that he's only a year or two removed from being a later teen. That's not concrete, I know, but most of this is about operating off of vibes, so... Moving forward, it's unclear how much time there is between the end of this film and Shrek 2. I said I imagine it takes months but not years for him to set himself up as a mercenary with a reputation, but that doesn't account for what time he spends in Spain before coming to Far, Far Away, and doesn't account for what time he spends in Far, Far Away before establishing himself, I guess. It really seems like Puss is going on a lot of adventures with Kitty, and that has to account for like years, I would say. Maybe not many, not like 7, it could be 7, but it's gotta be a good chunk, I would say. Combining that with the 2 years from Shrek 2 to Forever After, I think it's likely that Puss is near 30. Probably not over 30, but the gap from his movie to Shrek 2 could be larger. To get to our latest point in the timeline, we get back to The Last Wish, which I already went over as it seeming to be quite a ways off. There's a lot that Puss had to get up to. His entire arc in the film is based on aspects of his character that are unique to that film. It's only here where he's a legend all across Spain, where he ruined things with Kitty and has to make up for it. Even the only time he's not committed to really having anyone in his life. All of this is really far removed from where he was at chronologically when we last saw him in Forever After. Also, side note, with both of his films, it makes his role in Forever After, like, really bizarre. Like, obviously, technically, the entire movie, or most of it, never actually happens, but it's still insane to think that the Puss in Boots we know would end up as Fiona's fat pet. Anyway, my point is it really seems like it's been a long time since Forever After. And of course, in real life, it was about 12 years. 12 years could be the intended time jump. I don't think that would be out of place. Seems like plenty of time for Puss to return to Spain, become this big legend, reconnect with Kitty to the point of her asking him to marry her, have their falling out with him returning to his life being a legend, to then the events of the film. Nothing in the film indicates that it's 12 years, though. It could be like 8, could even be like 5. I doubt that, though. I think it is intended to be a pretty significant amount of time. Even just going off of the way he delivers the old friends line makes it seem like it has to be a very long time.
Off to find new adventures and to see some old friends.
Gotta consider as well that he likely didn't leave for Spain immediately after Forever After. I'm sure he still spent a fair amount of time with his friends before he left. I don't have a good transition into this bit, but I want to quickly go over 2 things. One, Antonio Banderas' age does not factor into this. I don't think Puss is in his 60s. Not to say I would mind if he were. Same with Kitty being near 60, right? Like, hello. But yeah. That would be an extreme jump in time. I don't think that's the case. So actors' ages, they're not factoring in here. The other thing is that Puss's life flashes before his eyes, obviously, and most of the stuff there is from the original movie and with a single shot of Shrek and Donkey. For it being his life flashing before his eye, there doesn't appear to be much recent stuff. What I'm leading into is I can see this being construed into an argument that this doesn't take place that long after Forever After, but I think this hypothetical argument that probably no one would make is silly. So I am now disregarding it after being the one to bring it up. Useless tangent out of the way, what is my ultimate conclusion? I think that Puss is around 40. Roughly a decade passing since we last saw him chronologically, I think makes sense. And I don't think it's less than that. He could be a bit older, even. I don't think older than like 45. 40 to 45 feels like a reasonable age range to estimate how old he probably is. Of course, this is only the first part of this video. Now it's time to figure out when he died. 7 deaths are currently unaccounted for in this timeline, so let's figure them out. Except, it's time for another tangent. You might have noticed, emphasis on might, that I have not yet mentioned the Netflix series, The Adventures of Puss in Boots. If you know anything about it, you know why, but if you don't know anything about it, I have some explaining to do. First of all, I'm sure one would assume the show takes place after the 2011 movie and before Shrek 2. One would be wrong, because it's actually set in the 7-year time gap between the 2011 movie and its flashback. That's not like crazy or anything. It just makes it completely irrelevant to establishing the timeline. So there just wasn't a reason to bring it up. So first off, the basic plot of the show is Puss is up to some antics when he spots this white lady cat. Her name is either Dulcinea, Dulcinea. I don't know. I should have looked this up beforehand. My bad. But he sees whatever her name is, spots her entering a magically hidden town, and he follows her through this like invisible magic barrier whatever thing, which apparently fucks up some of the magic and puts this town in danger for 6 seasons of various nonsense. And it's a lot of increasingly nonsensical nonsense. Like, they open a portal to hell, they fight this guy called the Blood Wolf, there's like an evil alternate timeline version of Puss who's like killed a bunch of the others. It's ridiculous. And the finale is the most insane part. And it's the reason I'm not considering the show in this video, because I think it clearly renders itself not canon. First of all, near the end, Puss is killed by Dulcinea, whatever. And it's not technically her, but I'm not about to explain the overarching later story of this series. You can watch this Haley Whipjack video, which is where all of my knowledge about this show comes from. I like her stuff. She's very funny. And who wouldn't want to watch a 5.5-hour video on all of Shrek? Anyway, back to my bit. So Puss dies. Like, he's just flat out dead, but doesn't come back with one of his 9 lives. He only comes back because no longer sort of possessed Dulcinea gives him a true love's kiss. That alone renders this non-canon, I would say, but there's more. So, whatever. Standard Shrek fare, he's brought back, cool. Except not cool, because the world fucking ends. It's just gone. That's it. They've got a powerful wizard guy in town who saves just the town, but the rest of the world's just gone. The town is just floating out in space. So then the wizard guy tells Puss that this happens in every single timeline where Puss comes to this town. Without fail, the world ends up completely destroyed. So the wizard guy has to send Puss back in time to the moment he chose to enter the town, so he can choose not to do that. So he gets sent back and he makes the choice. This is fucked up, right? Like, we don't know exactly how much time he spent in this town, but it wasn't insignificant. He built up all of these relationships with all of these people, and now it's all gone. All of it. And he remembers all of it, but they don't. And he can't ever see them again because it would end the entire fucking world. That's hilariously fucked up. It also means that technically none of the show ever happened from a timeline perspective, extra rendering it pointless in figuring out his age. It also renders itself even less canon by having Dulcinea also go back in time to be with Puss. When Puss was sent back, it's like he went into his past self. There's only one Puss in the past, and it's so he can make this choice to not enter the town. But when Dulcinea goes back, she goes back physically. So there's like two of her out and about. And, obviously, she's not in any of the Shreks, neither Puss in Boots. So, technically she could have, like, died or had some massive painful falling out with Puss, which is why she never appears and is never brought up. But that's kind of silly to consider. So I think it makes more sense, especially with the whole death thing, that the whole show just isn't canon. It also means it's pointless and has no bearing on anything. Aren't you so glad I spent all this time talking about it? I had fun. Now, though, we can finally get to talking about Puss's deaths. We're given them in order, which is important to keep in mind. His first death, he explicitly tells us, happened in Pamplona, meaning it was in Spain, and his flirty side is very present, so my bet is this death happened prior to the original Puss in Boots. It could happen after, but it just feels more fitting if it happened before. Lines up with his character as we know it from the film. His second death with the dogs is indeterminate. It could fit in literally anywhere in the timeline, so I'm just going to leave it alone for now. His third death seems to have him somewhere else in Europe. I'm not good at identifying architecture. I'd be terrible at doing GeoGuessr quickly. But it doesn't seem Spanish. Plus these mountains and snow, it gives the impression that this is supposed to be somewhere other than Spain. His fourth death is also indeterminate in location. We've got this guy in the back, but he looks like a guy who would fit in literally any of the places we know from this series. So this brings us to our fifth death. I hope it's just his. This brings us to his fifth death, and the one that introduces a weird wrinkle into this, because this death is elaborated on in the short that comes with the DVD edition of The Last Wish. The problems with it are that it's set in Del Mar, and Goldie and the Bears appear. Now, inherently, this doesn't mean anything. It's just that in The Last Wish, it definitely came across like Del Mar was not a place that Puss went to regularly, nor that him and Goldie and the Bears were, like, acquainted. But technically all of it works. Knowing of each other doesn't mean Puss and Goldie plus the Bears were, like, actually acquainted. And helping a town years ago doesn't mean Puss would be super familiar with it later. It does make me think the time gap between the original Puss in Boots and Shrek 2 is actually larger than I originally assumed. That doesn't really affect my judgment on his age, though. I gave a year range for a reason on that. The other interesting thing here is him and Kitty seemingly don't have the same kind of relationship they had by the end of the 2011 film. Closer to how they are in The Last Wish, but, of course, everything about this needs to be considered from the perspective that this is made from the assets that they had for The Last Wish, and it's a story Puss is telling, so it's a retrospective, and that can influence, like, the perspective on it, the memory of it a bit. We could even be seeing it from, technically, Perito's perspective, which could be skewing because of how he knows these two, how he's imagining things playing out in their relationship and everything. It still feels weird to think all this happened prior to the Shrek movies, considering the huge time gap between the last wish and this, but whatever. Bringing up the Shreks, that brings us to his 6th and his 7th deaths, which pretty clearly have to happen in Far, Far Away. His 6th one, he's at a restaurant with an American waitress, so presumably he's in Far, Far Away.
Excuse me, does this have shellfish in it?
Yes, sir.
And then for the 7th one, Gingy's just there. So he has to be there. That's where his friends, his old friends, were. So that's all 7 deaths. And by my estimate, that means he lost 7 of his lives by the time he was 30. Which makes it interesting then that it took 10 to 15 more years before he lost the 8th one. I also judge it as at least 3 of those lives were lost in time from the 2011 movie to Shrek 2. Potentially 4 of them, because the second death could happen anywhere. But it just feels better to place it with the first death before the 2011 movie, I would say. It just balances out nicely. So that makes it 2 deaths in this 7-year span. 3 deaths in this 5 to 7 year span. 2 deaths in this 2-year span. And then no deaths in this 10 to 15 year span. Makes it kind of funny how Death was watching him that whole time, because his point feels a little less impactful when it took so long for Puss to lose his 8th life, but obviously it was about Puss's attitude rather than when, like, the literal losing of his lives was all a result of his lack of care. It's the lack of care that's the problem. Still, it's kind of gay to be paying such close attention to another man for that long, if you ask me. I don't really have a wrap-up for this. I think it's interesting. Puss lived what is probably about half his life and lost 8 of his lives in that time. It makes sense for the lesson he had to learn, but it's still interesting, obviously. Oh, I should mention this comment he makes in Shrek 2.
It was nothing personal, senor. I was doing it only for my family. My mother, she's sick, and my father lives off the garbage. The king offered me magic gold, and I have a litter of brothers.
Whoa.
I'm not sure this was ever meant to be more than just him tossing something out there, just like a throwaway bit of untruth. Like, meaningless here. I think that's all I have. This was really just an excuse to get to talk about Puss in Boots for a while. Now at least you have some useless information on the lore of the funny cat from Shrek. Whip that out at your cousin's wedding. Have a good one.